Hello, Math Grade 7 students. This is Mr. Underkoffler, and today we're going to be doing some review on solving equations using inverse operations. So problem number 1, let me kind of refresh your memory on how these problems work. The initial thing you need to do, first of all, make sure you copy this down because this is not a handout that I gave you at all. These are just problems we're going to do on a separate sheet of paper. So write this down. Negative 8y plus 62 equals negative 36. The very first thing you need to do is off to the side. Let's figure out what's happening to the variable. If you would like to abbreviate that as WHTTV, totally fine with me. So obviously the variable is the y. And so when I ask what's happening to the variable, I'm asking what's happening to that y. And I can see this negative 8 is right next to it, and that means the y is being multiplied by that negative 8. But there's more on the left-hand side where that variable is located. We also see then it is being added by 62, and so that's why we would say the second thing happening to the variable is being added by 62. I want to remind you, when you answer what's happening to the variable, that is in the traditional order of operations, meaning that's the order of PEMDAS, where multiplication comes before addition. So that's a good refresher for you. When you answer what's happening to the variable, it's your regular order of operations, PEMDAS, where multiplication is before addition, division will be before subtraction, that kind of thing. But the next thing you figure out is what's the inverse of the two things that you were just saying, because that's going to determine what you do underneath the equation on both sides to solve. And I need to remind you of what the word inverse means. The word inverse means do the opposite. So not only would we say the inverse of multiplication is division and the inverse of addition is subtraction, but the order that you do your inverse operations in has to also be the opposite order from how you answer what's happening to the variable. And therefore, the very first thing that you will inverse is the adding by 62. And that inverse, of course, would be subtracting by 62. And that's what you're going to do on both sides of the equation first. Later on, you will do the inverse of the first thing that was happening to the variable, which was multiplying by negative 8. And of course, that inverse would be to divide by negative 8. All right, so like I said, we're going to do the first inverse, which is subtracting by 62. Hopefully, you wrote it underneath the equation on both sides. Subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. I would do that before I work down. On the left, you have negative 36 plus negative 62. When you have a negative plus a negative, add in your head. Please do this without a calculator if at all possible. 6 plus 2 is 8. 3 plus 6 is 9. So that gives you negative 98. On the left side, notice I did not make it adding the opposite. And the reason why I didn't is because I didn't really need to. I have 62. Take away 62. We all know that's 0. So there really isn't much of a benefit at that place to make the subtraction become adding the opposite. If you want to still make it adding the opposite, you could. You're still going to get 0. So I'm going to start giving you some freedom of when you make it subtraction adding the opposite and when you possibly don't. Notice the negative 8y just drops down. It does not disappear. It's still there. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the negative 8y plus 0, because anything plus 0 is itself. And so that's just going to give you negative 8y. Obviously, you're writing all this down. From here, you will finally do the second inverse operation, because now's the time to do it. We have negative 8y, which means y is times negative 8. So we're going to do the inverse, which is to divide by negative 8. And then let's work down once again on both sides. A negative divided by a negative is going to give you a positive. And okay, maybe now's where it makes sense to use a calculator here if you want. Negative 98 divided by negative 8. If you punch that into your calculator, you will get 12.25. And yes, it's a decimal. It's okay. There's no rule that says every answer has to be a pretty whole number. No, 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 no. So please don't think anymore that if you get a decimal or a mixed number or a fraction, that guarantees that you messed up. That might have been true in grades K through 6. It is not true anymore. We totally could have decimal or fraction answers. They are fair game. Oh, by the way, I'm not done. 1y means 1 times y, which of course is just the same as y. That's how you know you're done. Once you get the variable by itself, then that means you have solved the equation. And that means you have found the one and only number that makes the original equation true for what that variable could equal. And what I mean by that is you could actually take the variable y, substitute it with 12.25. So that means you would take it times -8, then add by 62, and you should get the number on the right side of the equal sign, which is -36. If you don't believe me, you can try it right now. -8 times 12.25, then add by 62, and you should get -36, which proves that you have indeed found the solution for this equation. All right, problem number 2. Write this one down, and I would like for you to hit pause on the video and answer what's happening to the variable and what's the inverse. So hit pause, answer those questions with the words off to the side, then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. Okay, I hope you have done that. Hopefully you said the variable was being divided by -16 and then subtracted by 76. But when you do your inverse operations, the order must be reversed because the word inverse means do the opposite. So the very first inverse you should do is the inverse of subtracting by 76, which is to add by 76. Then later on, the next inverse will come from the inverse of the first thing happening to the variable, which was dividing by -16, and the inverse of that is to multiply by -16. Now, I would like for you to hit pause in the video and actually do the inverse operations underneath the equation on both sides. Work down, get your answers. Once you're done and you have solved and got the W by itself, then hit play to see how you did so you can check your work. Okay, I hope you have already done all the math underneath the original equation and you've solved and you got your final answer, because now I am going to reveal how it should have worked out. Pencils and erasers ready, let's see how you did. Did you do the first inverse, adding by 76 underneath on both sides like you said you were going to? Before you work down, you need to realize subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. I would actually do that on the original equation like you saw I'm doing right now. And -76 plus 76, of course, is 0. The right side, -76 plus -72 plus +76. I'm looking at the right-hand side here. When you work down, when you have a negative plus a positive, you subtract in your head. That's how I got 4. So that's going to give you W over -16. That's still there. Just drop it down. Plus 0 is just W over -16, because anything plus 0 is itself. Now, from here, I've seen a lot of kids do the wrong thing. And the reason why I see a lot of kids do the wrong thing is they see that fraction bar and they're thinking in their head, oh, I should divide. No, you shouldn't. Remember how we said the inverse of that was to multiply? Well, then that's why you need to multiply by -16 on both sides. I know. 16 is divisible by 4. I know. So you might have thought, therefore, you should divide in your head. No. Do the inverse of division, which is multiplication. And that's going to give you 1W equals -64. Of course, 1W is the same as W. And that's how you get the final answer to this problem. If you made a mistake, obviously you should fix it. And then we'll move on to problem number 3. All right, problem number 3. Once again, I would like for you to hit pause in the video, figure out what's happening to the variable, figure out what the inverse operations would be. So hit pause in the video, figure out those things right now, then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. Okay, I hope you have already figured out what's happening to the variable. If you said the variable was multiplied by 11 and then subtracted by 80, you are not correct, because you cannot read backwards with subtraction. This is something I just taught you very recently. You cannot read backwards, right to left. You cannot read backwards with subtraction. You can only read backwards with multiplication and with addition. And so on this problem, you must make subtraction, adding the opposite first, before you answer what's happening to the variable, because the variable is on the right side of what was a subtraction problem. And so that's why you have to read backwards to answer what's happening to the variable. And like I just said, you cannot read backwards with subtraction. That's why you must make subtraction adding the opposite first. And therefore the variable was multiplied by negative 11, not positive 11. And then it was added by 80. You can read backwards with addition. You can. You cannot read backwards with subtraction. That's why you have to make it add in the opposite first. All right, so if you messed up with the what's happening to the variable, then obviously that means you messed up then with your inverse operations, and you have some things to erase and fix. The first inverse should come from the inverse of the last thing happening to the variable. What was last will get inversed first. What was first will get inversed last, because the word inverse means do the opposite, and so we're also doing the opposite order for what was happening to the variable. So later on you will divide by negative 11. All right, let's do the first inverse on both sides, which we had just got done saying was subtracting by 80. So we're going to do that on both sides. Make sure you line it up properly. Oh, you should hit pause on the video. My bad. Hit pause on the video. Do all the work underneath the equation on both sides. Finish solving, then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. All right, I hope you have solved this problem. I almost started solving it for you. That was funny. Hopefully you already solved this by yourself, and let's check to see how you did. So as I had accidentally already shown you, you should have subtracted by 80 on both sides. And yes, you need to line it up the way that I have it lined up. That minus 80 on the left better be underneath the positive 80. It would make no sense to line it up underneath the negative 11n, because that's not what you're inversing at that moment when you subtract by 80. You're inversing the adding by 80. So line it up underneath the place that you are actually inversing. Furthermore, it wouldn't make sense to put the minus 80 underneath the negative 11n, because they wouldn't be like terms. And whenever you add or subtract, you could only add or subtract when you have like terms. So that's the other reason why it must be underneath the positive 80. Of course, the other minus 80 better be underneath the right-hand side of the equation, which is underneath the negative 107. All right, subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. And if you do that on the right, then you're going to have a negative plus a negative. You can add in your head. 7 plus 0 is 7. 10 plus 8 is 18. So you're going to get negative 187. I don't really know if you need to make the left-hand side become adding the opposite. You can probably figure out by yourself that 80 take away 80 would give you 0 without making it adding the opposite. So I'm cool if you don't make that part adding the opposite. Of course, 0 plus negative 11n is negative 11n by itself, because anything plus 0 is that thing itself. From here, we will now divide by negative 11, because that's the second inverse, which now makes sense to do. A negative divided by a negative is going to give you a positive. I bet you probably used a calculator for this part on the right. Negative 187 divided by negative 11 gives you 17. Yes, a boring, pretty whole number. Again, please do not think that you're always going to get pretty whole numbers. That's not always going to be the case like it was on problem number 1. The left-hand side gives you 1w, because any number divided by itself is 1. And yes, that's a positive 1, because it was a negative divided by a negative. I assume that you already checked to make sure that you had all the negative signs that should exist here. So again, negative 11 divided by negative 11 gives you positive 1, and 1 times w is the same as just w, and that's how you get the variable by itself. 2 more problems that I want you to try. Number 4, number 5. Try them on your own. Then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. So hit pause now, do 4 and 5, then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. All right, number 4. When you ask what's happening to the variable, there's only one thing happening to the variable. I know. We just did 3 problems in a row where there were 2 things happening to the variable, something first and something second. That's because there was 2 numbers on that side of the equation with the variable. But on number 4 and on number 5, there is not 2 things happening to the variable. There's only one thing. Same thing on number 5. There's only one thing happening to the variable. So the reason I gave you these problems is to remind you that yes, you could have equations where there's only one thing happening to the variable, and therefore only one inverse operation to do. Please do not think that for some reason you have to force these problems into becoming like two things happening to the variable. I've seen some kids do it, where they make the w become 1w. And yes, it's the same as 1w, but there's no reason to do that. Because then you're going to have, what are you going to say? It's being multiplied by 1, then later you're going to divide by 1? You know dividing by 1 doesn't change anything. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's only one thing happening to the variable. It was subtracted by negative 81, therefore you should add by negative 81. Likewise on number 5, there's only one thing happening to the variable. It was multiplied by negative 18, and therefore there is only one inverse operation to do, and that would be to divide by negative 18. So if you now realize that you did not correctly figure out that there was only one thing happening to the variable and therefore one inverse operation to do, then maybe you should hit pause on the video again, so that way you can clean up your work that you did underneath number 4's equation and underneath number 5's equation. So if you have to hit pause to fix your mistakes, do that now. Okay, hopefully you have already fixed whatever you needed to fix. Let's see how you did. Number 4, did you do the inverse that we said we were going to do? Add by negative 81. Do it underneath on both sides. Now, before you work down, you should make subtraction become adding the opposite, which will make it adding a positive, because the opposite of a negative is a positive. So hopefully you made that become adding the opposite. Then you can work down, because then you will correctly see that you are going to have a positive 81 plus a negative 81, and that, of course, would give you 0. If you do not make subtraction adding the opposite, then you would have been fooled into thinking that you had negative 81 plus another negative 81, and you would have thought you would have got negative 162. This is why Mr. Underkother tells you to make subtraction adding the opposite if it's on the original equation before you work down. All right, on the right-hand side, a negative plus a negative, you're going to add in your head. 4 plus 1 is 5. 1 plus 8 is 9. Of course, the 200 still stays, and that's how you get negative 295. Of course, w plus 0 on the left becomes just w, and that's how you get the variable by itself. Problem number 5. We already said the variable was originally being multiplied by negative 18. By the way, I hope you didn't say, for what's happening to the variable, that it was being multiplied by 498. No, 498 didn't have the variable. When I say the variable, I mean the letter on the original equation. You always have to find it to be able to see what's next to it in order to answer what's happening to that variable. All right, and we already said the inverse of multiplying by negative 18 is to divide by negative 18, and that's why we're going to do that underneath the equation on both sides. Now, on the left side, I bet you used a calculator, because I definitely would have as well, and I'm a math teacher. But the right side, negative 18 divided by negative 18, we don't need to punch that into a calculator. We should know any number divided by itself is going to give you 1. And a negative divided by a negative is a positive 1. Now on the left-hand side, a positive divided by a negative will give you a negative answer. And this was a repeating decimal. Your calculator might have put a 7 at the very, very end, because a lot of calculators will round at the end if the next digit that's off the screen would be a 5 or higher. And so that's why a lot of your calculators probably said negative 27.666666666 and then put a 7 at the end. The 7 does not really exist. It's just your calculator rounding. So we're almost done. 1a is the same as a, and therefore you get negative 27.6 repeating. If you add negative 27 and 2/3, because I think some calculators might give you a mixed number answer, that is totally fine. By the way, if you have a Casio calculator that gave you a really ugly improper fraction as the answer, you have a key somewhere on that calculator called S to D, like an S with an arrow next to it and a D. If you hit that key, it will give you the decimal version of the answer, and then you will see what I'm saying, negative 27.6 repeating. And that concludes the equations that I wanted to review with you today. You already have some extra practice worksheets. It might be very wise to start doing some of those extra practice worksheets to get yourself better at solving equations, because you will eventually, in about a week or so, have a quiz on solving equations. So doing some extra practice would be very advisable. All right, that concludes today's video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.